Welcome, everybody, to the Disability Vote Coalition's first webinar of 2026. We are going to talk today about absentee and early in-person voting. We're also going to talk about some important dates for you to be aware of and what elections are coming up this year, just to get you prepared and start the year off right. So first, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about the Vote Coalition. So we are a nonpartisan effort. Our goal is to make sure that people with disabilities are fully included in the electoral process, from registering to vote to casting a ballot, making sure they can access polling places, anything to do with voting. Our goal is to get more people with disabilities voting. The coalition is coordinated by the Disability Rights Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities. And then the coalition, it also includes lots of community partners like independent living centers, people with disabilities, lots of other partners. Anybody interested in disability and voting can contact us for more information or to be part of the coalition. I am Jenny Newgard. I am with the Board for People with Developmental Disabilities and co-lead the coalition. And you will hear from a couple other coalition members later in the webinar. So I always like to include this slide because it's very profound, I think. So if people with disabilities voted at the same rate as people without disabilities, that would be almost 2 million more votes. So a lot of times we hear that people feel like my vote won't matter, it's just one vote. But when you look at that statistic, people with disabilities as a voting bloc are very powerful. We have a voice if we use it. So a couple other reasons we put on there about why it's so important to vote is because elected officials make decisions on things that are important to us. So they need to hear from us. They can't help us with issues if they don't know we're out there and what we're struggling with. It shows elected officials that we care and that we are paying attention. It can change the way an elected official votes on an issue. And local elections, we talk about local elections a lot because they are just as important as national elections, and they get so few people that turn out. But the local elections are people who are deciding things like how your tax dollars are spent and what roads are going to get fixed next, and will there be another stoplight? Will my trash be picked up? All those kinds of things are made at the local level. And most importantly, it's your civic responsibility. We all have a responsibility to vote, and it is a privilege. So this is an overview of election dates and deadlines to be aware of this year. I'm not going to read through all these, but you will have this to refer back to. I do want to mention that the next election for some of you is February 17th. We do not have a statewide primary, so not everyone will be voting on February 17th. There are some local primaries, not very many. It was like under 30, I believe. So we encourage you to check, and we will show you how to do that in a few slides in. Check to see if you have a local primary or not. You can see the deadlines on there to register. You have until January 28th, so just over a week if you're not registered yet, or you can register in person that day. So the next big statewide election that we all need to be aware of is April 7th. That's the spring election. You have until March 18th to register, or again, you can register on election day. We'll also show you how to check your registration. Um, and then we've got the August and November elections. These are called the midterm elections because it's halfway between presidential elections, and there are a lot of important offices that we will be voting on. So April 7th, again, another one that lots of people tend to skip out on, is really important. It's another Supreme Court race. So there are two candidates that are running for that. There are lots of places where you can find out information about those candidates, and we provide those resources as well. There's also other courts being voted on, Court of Appeals, circuit courts, other lower courts. And then there will be local elections. Again, talking about how important that is, things like school boards, lots of county positions. And then in August, it's the partisan primary that will narrow the candidates for what we will actually see on the general election ballot. So there are lots of Democrats and Republicans running for office, and we have to narrow that down to one governor or one Democrat and one Republican. Same for all these other offices. So Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State, Treasurer, those are all really big high level state offices that we should be paying attention to. All eight of our congressional representatives are up for election. All 99 of our representatives, half of our state senators, 17, and then things like county sheriffs and county clerks. So all of those positions really impact your lives, and you want to make sure that your candidate makes it to the general election. So it's important to still vote in the partisan primary. Um, Next one. So there's a lot going on, and I talked about that. The February one, where not everybody's gonna be voting in that election. So how do you know? We also talk a lot about My Vote Wisconsin. It's just such a great website to find out anything about voting. And my favorite thing about the website is the what's on my ballot. So you can see in the right-hand picture, there's a little black spot that says what's on my ballot, and there's all kinds of other things you can do on this website. And all you need to do is click on that, put in your address, and it will show you exactly what your ballot will look like when you go to vote. They have a certain amount of time to get it up there. So if you go now and don't see it, you've probably gone too early and you'll have to check back. But this will show you for the next upcoming election exactly who's on your ballot. I discovered this many, many years ago, but it was very helpful because there was one election I was caught a little off guard. It was local candidates and I didn't know who they were. And that's really frustrating when you go and you don't know who the people are. So I always go here in enough time to be able to find research or to be able to research and find out more about these candidates. And sometimes it's a little bit harder with local candidates to find information. Statewide races, it's pretty easy. There's several places you can go. So it might take a little extra time to figure out who you want to vote for. And then, all the legislators that are going to be elected this year, I thought it might be helpful for you to know that if you don't know who your current legislators are, that's also very easy to find. If you go to that website, legis.wisconsin.gov, again, put in your address and it'll pop up exactly who your legislators currently are. So, requesting an absentee ballot, one of the reasons we wanted to start the year with this webinar is because now is a great time to request your absentee ballot because you can do that now for the entire calendar year, as you can see on the graphic there, or you can choose certain elections that you want your ballot sent to. So some people who vote absentee all the time, it's great. Just click all elections, hit continue, and you can forget about it. It'll be sent to you automatically. Some people maybe prefer to vote in person, but February, not a lot of fun to go out with ice and things like that. So maybe you want your ballot for that one, and you'll see how it goes for the other elections. You can also request your absentee ballot at any time for those elections. We'll give you the deadlines on when you have to request those. So if you don't do it now, you can ask for that ballot anytime. You can also choose an indefinitely confined option due to age, physical illness, or infirmity, or if you're disabled for an indefinite period of time. So that's the definition of indefinitely confined. That it's slightly different in that you will receive an absentee ballot until you either request for it to stop or you don't return a ballot. If for some reason you missed an election, you can go back in and choose that indefinitely confined option again to get that going again. And being indefinitely confined does not mean that you can never leave your house. One of the easiest examples I always think of is if you have MS, multiple sclerosis, your disability and many disabilities are very unpredictable. So you might not know one day to the next if you'll be able to leave your house. And so that would be a reason that you could choose indefinitely confined. It doesn't mean you could never leave your house, but you just don't know if on election day I will feel well enough to go out to the polls myself. So we wanted to make you aware of that as an option as well. You do not have to prove that you have a disability. You won't have to submit anything or anything like that. You kind of self-describe. It's a button that you click when you register. So requesting the absentee ballot, the easiest way for a lot of people is to do it on myvotewisconsin.gov. And you click vote absentee, and that's where you will get that information about if you want the full calendar year or certain elections. The thing to know about doing it online, and this is what trips some people up, is the first time you request your absentee ballot, you will need to upload your photo ID. So just like voting in person, when you have to show your photo ID, you have to provide that. So sometimes people get a little hung up with how do I get my photo ID to my camera to upload it to the website. We can help with that. There's probably people you know in your life that can help with that if you're not sure how to do it. And that's the hardest part. So once you've uploaded it once, every time you go back in after that, it will be very easy and you're just clicking what ballot you want. You can also download an application for an absentee ballot from the Wisconsin Elections Commission website, complete that, and mail it back with a copy of your photo ID to your municipal clerk. You can find your municipal clerk at My Vote Wisconsin. You can email your clerk and request the ballot with your full name, your address, what election you're requesting it for, or the calendar year. Again, you'll need a copy of your photo ID unless it's already on file. And then you can do it in person. You can go to your clerk's office and apply for an absentee ballot there. Voting absentee, it's really important that you request as soon as possible. We're going to show you the deadline dates for that. It's the Thursday before an election, and we can tell you that's really risky. It's chances are it might not reach you by election day. Certainly, you won't be able to fill it out and return it by mail. So that's again why we're doing this so early in the year. You can request it now, and then you'll get it as soon as the ballots are available, which should give you plenty of time to complete your ballot and get it back. It's really important to follow the directions carefully. You don't want to make a mistake, so your ballot's not counted. Sometimes you will have time to fix a mistake if you made one, but if you get it back really close to the deadline, that can be difficult. It's very important to know you can request assistance with filling out your ballot with any part of voting. You just can't have your employer or your union rep assist you. When you vote absentee, you need a witness. The witness is there to make sure that you are the one who voted that ballot. And then again, return the ballot as soon as possible. It must be to your polling place or to your clerk by 8 p.m. on election day. So that's the closing of the polls. There's been a lot of talk about postmarks changing in the United States Postal Service. That should not impact anything here because we've always gone by it has to be there by 8 p.m. on election day. Wisconsin has not used the postmark. So don't let that confuse you about how things work here in Wisconsin. So the reason you have a witness is to verify that you completed the ballot. That person should never tell you who to vote for. The witness should see you complete your ballot, but they don't have to be right next to you and see the choices that you're making. They can be across the room and clearly see that you're the one voting that ballot. And then they need to sign the certificate envelope that comes with your ballot. You can see the signature of witness highlighted down there, and they should write their full address underneath the witness signature. That's an important one. You do not want to leave out the address. You and your assistant must sign and date the certificate and return the envelope on the line marked signature of voter. So that's where we say follow directions carefully. There are several places that you need to sign and date, and that your witness will need to sign and date and include their address. So I usually triple check, make sure I've got all of that complete before I return it. So, who can you get to sign as your witness? That can be tricky, especially if you live alone. A witness needs to be a U.S. citizen over the age of 18. It could be a friend, a spouse, a roommate, neighbor, family member, maybe a care worker that comes into your home. Some communities have drop-off locations that might have a staff person to witness your ballot. We saw that a lot, especially around COVID. They're not as common now. But a family friend or a neighbor that can watch you maybe through a window. This was advice we gave during COVID, but things are changing again where people are feeling a little unsafe leaving their house. So we feel like this is another option for you to be aware of. You can put the ballot in the envelope, seal it, leave it outside the door with someone, with the witness to sign. And if you're really having trouble and you can't find anybody, contact your clerk. They can help troubleshoot for you. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kathleen to introduce yourself and take you
Yeah.
through the rest.
Thanks, Jenny. Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Callan. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. And we at the council have been part of the DVC for quite some time. And yeah, I'll be taking on sort of the second half of this presentation. I'll just go ahead and acknowledge some of this information we've kind of already touched on before. And also, I want to point out that at the end, we'll have a list, a compilation of all these great resources, because I think some of you have already noticed a theme in that there are deadlines and there are certification needs, and there's an important thing to keep in mind when we're putting together a plan. So, that's kind of going to be the theme throughout, is making sure we know those dates, know how to do things, make our plans. And then also I always like to remind folks, and I think I sometimes have to remind myself too, that um, we can make a plan and then life happens. Life often happens, and then we have to pivot and make a change. So that's another reason why it's always good to kind of know what your other options are. So that way you can continue to vote, even if maybe your first choice for the person who usually gives you a ride or is your witness, or suddenly you're going to be out of town or you've got surgery or days, things change. So we always like to have that full picture of how voting can be done so we can make sure that more people can vote. All right, so important absentee voting deadlines. Again, these kind of vary. So these are the specific dates for this year, 2026. In order to request that absentee ballot, if you haven't done it for the full year and you're going to do it election by election, for just these first two, the important dates are by February 12th. That's when you need to request your absentee ballot for the February election, which you may or may not have. Remember that. Um, by April 2nd for the April election. And again, don't wait too long. We all know sometimes the mail can take a little bit longer than we expect. So go ahead, make that request as early. If you're thinking about it, go ahead and make that request. It just makes things a lot easier. And then again, as Jenny was saying, we need to return the absentee ballot by 8 p.m. on election day. And that means it needs to be received and returned. We don't think about postmarked, which is great. That makes it a little bit easier for us, but that does mean we need to, when we're doing our plan, we need to make sure that that ballot has actually been received by 8 p.m. on election day. Um, Early voting, that can take place, and that's, early voting is kind of shorthand, and we'll get into this a little bit more soon, but is that in-person absentee voting, a mouthful, so that's why I think a lot of us just kind of refer to it as early voting, but that it, those dates, that can take place starting 2 weeks prior to election, and it can look different ways. And again, I'll be talking about that soon. But the date then for that for these first two elections. For the February election, that means that the early in-person absentee voting can start February 3rd. And for the April election, that in-person absentee voting can start March 24th. Um, and this is something else. The right to assistance for voting, for those of us with disabilities, that is not just applicable to when we go in person to vote on election day. This means we have the right to assistance with any part of the voting process. So registering to a vote, requesting our absentee ballots, returning our absentee ballots, completing our absentee ballots. These are all things that we have the right to have assistance for. It's always kind of that same rule that when we ask for assistance, it can't be um, our employer or our union rep, but otherwise you can have your neighbor, a friend, a family member. These are all folks that can help us vote. And then also, I think it's important because there's still some, rumors out there. I think that's sometimes what we're doing here too, is to make sure folks know where to check those rumors. You can have assistance in returning, mailing, or delivering your ballots. And I'll go into specifics about some questions that can be asked, but you do have that right. If you complete your ballot and you have that witness, you can have somebody else. If you have a disability, you have the right to have someone return that ballot on your behalf. And then, but also to keep in mind that if you don't have a disability, then you don't have that right to have someone assist you with delivering your ballot. So that sometimes I think causes some confusion. And let's see. So information for that assister. And I'll just go ahead and say too, sometimes these words don't always make sense. So this is another reason it's always good to check with your municipal clerk, and it's okay if you don't use the right terms. So the assister is that person who is going to be, helping you out, especially in regards to returning your ballot. So if you have someone returning your ballot for you, um, I always like to let them know, give them a heads up of what questions or what it's going to look like when they're returning the ballot. So if they're returning it, and then when anyone turns in a ballot, their absentee ballot ahead of time, the clerk or whoever's there to, the staff person there receiving it can ask, are you the voter? And if you are, then you say yes. If not, then they can ask, are you delivering this ballot? And some might use this exact wording because this is sort of the set best practice wording. Or they might kind of ask it in different ways. But the important thing to know is that they're going to ask, if you are you assisting somebody with a disability? And that they can ask the person dropping off the ballot. That person can say yes, and should say yes. And then they might also then ask the person who's dropping off that ballot or assisting you with the ballot to make sure that that they're not one of those folks who can't, the employer, the union rep, that sort of thing. The question that they can't ask is they can't ask anything about what type of disability, and you can't be asked that either. People can't ask, well, what type of disability? Why can't you fill this out? Why can't they turn this in? That is not an okay question. So those are some questions that some folks will be asked. And again, kind of part of that planning. I like to know what to expect when I go into a place, and I also like to give that information to someone who's going to be assisting me. Um, and also to sometimes folks, I think that they might have to fill out a form, or someone might try to ask them to fill out a form, and there's no additional verification needed for assisting somebody. You don't have to write a letter or a note saying, my name is Kathleen, and I'm having so and so return this. You don't have to do that. It's that, and then the verification is just done with those few questions. If you want to check to make sure that your ballot has been received, that's another great resource, way to use My Vote. You can go in and check to see where that is in the process. So that can be, sometimes I know of folks, they're really nervous about whether or not it's been received, and maybe then they're having a good day, so they decide they're going to go in and and vote, and then vote in person and then not have their absentee ballot. But if you want to check, and I always, it's a good idea to check to make sure that it's been received and it's been processed. And yeah, and if it hasn't been received, again, I just want to make sure if it hasn't been received, you can vote in person. So even if you requested an absentee ballot, you do not then forfeit your right to vote in person. All right. So again, our in-person absentee voting, um, early voting, as it's I think more commonly known. These are, this is another way of voting. And some of it is for convenience. It has a lot of the same rights, but there are some differences. So you can vote in person, absentee, either at your municipal clerk's office or at a designated polling location, or location for that to take place. It might be different than your local polling place. I know in some locations, the early voting is only at one spot. So another thing that you can check on myvote.gov is where you could do that, or calling your clerk to find out. It might have different hours. I think sometimes folks might think it's the same as the regular, election day hours. It can be different hours. Um, and basically what you're doing is you're just taking the ballot and you're completing it right there. But it's not quite the same as, casting your ballot in real time. They'll often usually hold on to those ballots to be counted later. You will still need to show your photo ID, so that's going to feel the same. A lot of the process feels very much the same as when you're voting in person on election day. So, make sure to bring your photo ID. There'll be those dates and times you need to check. You have the same rights that you do in terms of getting assistance. As I said, you can that can start up to 2 weeks before. One, I think, key difference between voting on election day and voting in person, um, absentee voting on that early voting, is that curbside voting does not have to be offered. It often is. So again, call your clerk to find out if there's that option. But while curbside voting is a right that we have for election day voting, that is not necessarily a requirement for the in-person absentee voting or early voting. And then again, you can bring in a note sheet with you. You can ask for any of the same assistance that you might need, a magnifier, signature guide. Someone can help you. Those rights still apply both for the absentee voting in person or election day voting. All right, these are the rights that we're always going to say, and we will say until I feel like we're when more folks are voting. So always remember, and remember both for yourself and I think also for others. These are just some of the key rights that we have for those of us with disabilities. You have the right to vote privately and independently. That means that you can vote, on your own. If you need assistance with one part of the ballot, that doesn't mean you're going to need assistance for the whole thing. Um, it means that you can still vote privately. So if you have that um, accessible voting machine and it's located right in smack dab in the middle of the polling place, and everybody walking by in the library can see your ballot, that's not okay. We maintain the right to vote privately and independently, even when we are using accommodations and assistance. We have the right to access the polling place. So that means that there are you know, guidelines and restrictions about how heavy the doors should be, steps, there needs to be ramps, all of that. So you have the right to get in and out of that polling place. You have the right to an accessible voting machine at your polling place. And when to use it, that means it's got to be plugged in. People need to know how to use it. It needs to be in a space that is private, but is part of that polling place. Um, and that is definitely a right that we have. Um, we also have the right to ask for accommodations, and those accommodations can be, might need it one time and not again. Remember, disabilities can be both permanent and temporary. So, things that as suggestions, does someone need a chair to sit in maybe while they're waiting in line, or to sit down while they're actually completing the ballot? A signature guide, a magnifying glass, assistant stating your name. You are not required to like try to verbally say your name. If you don't have that ability, that is not. There are other ways, accommodations. So I kind of like to think of it as there are other options that we can still meet the requirements to verify that we have the right to vote and that we're completing the ballot correctly and meeting those guidelines. There are ways to accommodate those needs so we can all vote. Then you also have the right to assistance for marking your ballot. As we always say, we just want to make sure it's not your employer, it's not your union representative, but anybody else can help. You can ask a friend, a family member, someone to go along with you. You can ask for assistance from someone there at the polling place to help you, mark that ballot. You might be able to read the ballot and go through it, but sometimes it might just so you can vote more confidently to make sure that you complete those ballots if you're doing the paper ballot, or you need assistance voting with the voting equipment to make sure that the headphones are working so you can hear it if you're reading it as text to speech, or that it's the right magnification for you. You have the right, and I think sometimes folks get nervous and we want to make sure that we're complying with the rules and we don't want to cause um, any stress or any trouble, but we have the right to ask for assistance. And that just in the long run really does make it a better system for us, because then we can vote more confidently. All right, so I've already talked about, but just again to make sure, the accessible voting machine. Some folks maybe have used the accessible voting machine and not realized that it was, because this is sometimes used at the in-person early voting. Um, I know someone in one of the polling places that I've gone to refers to it as I think he called it like the speedy voting. Which I thought was fine, but it is the accessible voting machine. There's different versions of it that are out there. They have to be approved, but these are machines that every polling place is required to have at least one accessible voting system. That voting system must provide the opportunity for voters to vote privately and independently again, which often is kind of based on placement or whether or not there is some kind of privacy shields or way to just so that way other people can't look over your shoulder or behind you to see who you're voting for. You have the right that anyone can actually use the accessible voting system. I encourage folks, if you've never used it, try it out. It's really good. It also helps the more folks that ask to use it, then that means more folks are going to make sure that those who are working at the polling places know how to use it. And I'll be honest, there are folks, once they've tried it, they like it better because for a variety of reasons. So anyone has the right to use that accessible voting system. And it has to be the elections officials have to make sure that it's working properly. So that means that if you go up and they haven't turned it on yet, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be something that folks need to be alerted to because it's not just a matter of having it available. It needs to be functioning. People need to know how to use it. Um, and that can be, if it's not used very often, then that might be a challenge, but another reason for everybody to use it. All right, more rights. There's rights. We just have to keep reminding ourselves that we have them. Curbside voting. It is a right on at the polling place on election day. Um, Not for the in-person absentee, but on that day. Curbside voting can look differently. There's not necessarily one way to do curbside voting. So another reason to call ahead and ask your clerk. Some places, curbside voting means you or your driver might drive to a designated door. So I've heard of folks going up to a window and knocking. There's a doorbell someplace. You pull up someplace and you call a number. It can take on a variety of different looks and functions differently, but it is required that there is curbside voting option for election day. You have the right to file a complaint. And we talk about that filing a complaint, when in doubt, check it out. We'll talk about and we'll list some ways about doing it. But if we don't raise awareness and if we don't file these complaints, then a lot of these things aren't going to get fixed because people aren't even aware. The clerks might not be aware that there was this problem. So it is really important. It's our right, and actually, I kind of like to think of it as our, responsibility to file these complaints. If the accessible voting machine isn't placed in a private location, if they don't have the accommodations, all of those things, it can be frustrating. You don't have to do it in the moment. It can be. I always encourage folks to raise awareness of any questions they have at the time, but sometimes that can be really frustrating. It can be really discouraging and that's not the time. So you can file that complaint later. Um, if you make a mistake, you can request another ballot. Oopsies happen. It happens. And so let's keep that in mind that again, take that pressure off ourselves. If we think we made a mistake on our ballot, if we know we did, alert one of the election officials. They might have to, might take a little time. They might have to ask somebody else, but we can request another ballot. You can take that note sheet in with you if you're worried about remembering what voting yes versus voting no on some of the referendums. Those can be confusing. If you want to do a write-in vote and you want to make sure you're going to spell that person's name correctly, you can have that note sheet. If that brings you confidence on how to vote, you are allowed to bring in a note sheet. And always, always remember, no one should tell you how to vote. That is your decision. People can make suggestions and you can, take it or leave it. It is your right to vote how you want to vote, for who you want to vote. No one should ever tell you how to vote. Yeah. And then, as promised, two sheets or two slides here of resources. These are important, and I really love for folks to remember to have them. I try to keep these handy as well. Um, and these can be handy as you're making your plan to vote on election day or after election day. Some of these Disability Vote Coalition, that's who we are. There is a website. It has toolkits and fact sheets. Those can be great to help answer questions, refreshers on how these things work. A lot of those resources we're adding to it. They're in English, they're in Spanish, they're in large print. Facebook can be a great way to follow DVC because we'll send out reminders about when the elections are and when the deadlines are. A really important resource is the Disability Rights Wisconsin Voter Hotline. I can testify that is staffed. If someone doesn't answer the phone, there's going to be a callback very soon by really caring and knowledgeable staff. Um, and super helpful. So if you have questions or concerns on any part of the voting process, that's a great resource. You can call or you can email those questions. Also, your municipal clerk, that's what they're there for. So go ahead and, make that, if you have a question, you want to confirm that you're registered, all of that. Remember that not all keep the same business hours, so, it might take a little bit longer, but they're there. That is part of their role is to make sure that this process is done and done correctly. My vote with .wi.gov. My vote is how we usually refer to it. That is a great resource if you're trying to figure out dates, how to apply, who is my elected official? I can't remember. All of that information can be found there. Rides to the polls is such an important thing to know. So you have some backup, you have some options. Um, that is something you can also find on the Disability Vote Coalition's website, but there is a resource there that we're constantly updating and working to keep current so folks know based where they live, what options they have for if you need a ride to the poll. The Wisconsin Elections Commission, also a good resource. This is who you're going to call if you have a complaint or if you want to email it or visit their website. There's an online form. They're also a good resource for finding out, answering questions. They have staff who are there who focus on accessibility voting rights and options and keeping those, keeping our process as accessible as possible. So again, that when you call that number, you're going to get, you might have to get a call back, but you're going to get someone who can answer your questions basically on all things elections related. My Vote Wisconsin, great site for those that like to do their checking and double checking. And then we also want to point out that getting a photo ID can be a barrier for voting. It is, and so it's also important when we talk about making our plan is making sure that you know where your ID is. You make that plan on how to get it. Calling the DMV if you need assistance or make a plan for that so you know the hours and things like that. But there is a voter ID helpline. So that way, if you're having trouble, navigating, there's different forms of IDs now. What's the difference between a real ID and a voter ID and um, things like that? It's, all these things can be confusing, but there's resources and folks who we are out here who want to help navigate that, kind of sometimes confusing, but very important process. And that are all our slides. So thank you, everybody. I know we went through that really quickly. It's a lot of information, but um, this will be shared, the website, the information, the resources will be shared, this recording will be shared. We're going to have additional webinars this year. We'll have one, we're looking at March and then the summer and fall. We're going to do one on guardianship. We'll do one on knowing what's on your ballot. And then also we are hoping to do one on um, tips and tricks on how to ask for accommodations and assistance. So, and let us know if you have questions, when in doubt, check it out. That's what we're here for. Jenny, anything else that I've forgotten or
Yeah, one thing I want to mention, Lisa Hassenstab is our partner. She is the co-lead of the coalition from Disability Rights Wisconsin, and she wanted to make sure we mentioned the advice now is to return your ballot at least 2 weeks before the election if you're going to use the mail, like a minimum of 2 weeks to be sure that it gets there in time. Wendy, were there any questions that came through the Q&A we should address?
There was just one other comment about how some of the things that we mentioned, and I believe that Kathleen might have said that this as well. Some of the rights that we mentioned that you have are things that are available at the polling place on election day, but they're not always at the early voting sites. So that's something to be aware of. And that
That
was,
is correct.
yeah, yeah,
So what we would recommend is if you need specific accommodations, you know what you need, call ahead and see if they would be offered, find out what you're up against. Because every early voting polling site or location, it's not considered a polling site, it is different from times to what accommodations they provide. And that is because they don't consider it a polling site, like on
Thanks.
election day. I noticed what we didn't have, the places to find out more about your candidates are places like Ballotpedia and Vote 411. So I'm
Mhm.
going to add that to the slides.
Great.
They
Great.
are nonpartisan sites you can go to get um, basic information about the candidates. It's usually a survey that they've responded to, so you can compare side by side how they responded to certain questions to help you make up your mind about who you'd like to vote for. All right. I think that brings us to the end. We thank you for joining us today, and we will let you know about our next webinar as soon as we've got the date.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Leah. I'm just gonna shut it down, I guess.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
Wendy, Rockstar. Thank you all. Oh.